Riyadh, unmute yourself.
Okay, here we go. All right, let's try this again. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to day 14 of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs Ramadan webinar series. Our session today is titled The Caliphate and its Discontents, and we'll cover the ever more important question of the Caliphate in Islamic political thought. My name is Riyadh Ladian. I'm a research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's session with our speaker and my teacher, Dr. Awaimer Anjum, who will elaborate on his recent article for the Yaqeen Institute, which asks a simple but pertinent question: who wants the Caliphate? Dr. Anjum is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. His work focuses on the nexus of theology, ethics, politics, and law in classical and medieval Islam, with a comparative interest in Western thought. While trained as an historian, his work is essentially interdisciplinary, drawing on the fields of classical Islamic studies, political philosophy, and cultural anthropology. Dr. Anjum obtained his PhD in Islamic intellectual history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the author of Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought. He recently completed the decade-long project of translating Ibn al-Qayyim's Madarij al-Salikin, or Ranks of the Divine Seekers, which is the largest single-author English translation of a classic Islamic text. Without further delay, Dr. Anjum, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can everybody hear me? Okay, very good. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. My topic today is the Caliphate and its discontents. The question is the arguments put forth against the Caliphate, for the Caliphate, and my view of where we need to go. The argument that I have made in the article that Riyadh referred to, published by Yaqeen, Who Wants the Caliphate, and in my other writings, including one's forthcoming, is that based on thorough engagement with Islamic theology and history, both theory and practice, as well as contemporary Muslim predicament and the intellectual current, I propose that we need a bold vision for the future of Muslim societies. And this bold vision is that the classical Islamic institution of the Caliphate is in fact a desirable and feasible institution for the Muslim world today. And even more importantly, it is an indispensable discursive site for the imagination of Muslim political future. It is far more likely than the current nation-state system to guarantee stability, intellectual and sophistical and socio-political development of Muslim societies and Muslim thought, and the ability to confront the political, economic, and ecological crises that define our era. This is so in part because the Caliphate, in my view, can deliver better than any other ideological framework the conditions of political legitimacy. And so the question is how? Now I concede that if understood as a medieval theocratic absolutism, the Caliphate would be a bad idea, possibly even worse than the existing autocratic regimes, although it's very difficult to get to be worse than that. What I want to demonstrate, however, is that both history and normative Muslim political theory, medieval and modern, suggest a range of possibilities for the actualization of the caliphate. So a theocratic absolutism, although in the offing, by some Muslim groups certainly, is certainly not the dominant mode in which the caliphate was ever practiced. That in fact, the institution varied widely with respect to the relative powers and functions of the caliph and its relationship to local government. In its longest lasting version, which legal scholar Noah Feldman called classical Islamic constitutionalism, the caliphate was a nomocratic, a law-centered rather than a theocratic institution, one in which the powers of the caliph were limited both in practice and in theory, although they were often restrained in practice in ways differently from what we find in theory. Nonetheless, they were significantly restrained, and the caliphate was imagined and reimagined in different ways, for instance, in the Ottoman period. And more recently, it has been plausibly, if somewhat vaguely, imagined by contemporary Muslim thinkers of the last century or so as a confederation of semi-independent states like the early United States or the European Union, albeit within a broadly Islamic constitutional framework. So that's a formulation of the problem that I posed for myself. And what I want to do today is to look at a few objections that are typically offered to such a vision that's called too bold, nostalgic, unrealistic, unfeasible, unnecessary, religiously unnecessary, and sort of at best a Pollyannish understanding of where the world could go. So here are the arguments. First, the arguments, which Riyadh is very familiar with, in fact knows more than I do, and is writing, inshallah, a paper on it, is the question that is the charge of nostalgia, that in fact talking about the caliphate is simply nostalgic. That is, it wants to look back at the history of the caliphate, thinks of that in terms that are all rosy and colorful, where in fact you had a really bloody history. And therefore, this very idea of wanting to bring back the caliphate is a bad idea, one that wants to turn back the clock of time. Then there are arguments that one could say it's not in the Quran argument, that the caliphate is not a religiously required institution, and because it's not found in the Quran. And then there are arguments that look at various features of the caliphate and point out that, look, Muslims in fact were never united, that in fact Muslims, it's often said that the Muslim world does not exist, that it is in fact a construction of the late 19th century Ottoman imagination, created for the purpose of the geopolitics of the time against the European powers, the Ottoman caliphs are trying to call on the Muslim support and so forth. And then there are substantive problems posed, such as the religious minorities, secular Muslims, and so on, and why that such a vision would be effectively hegemonic and will not be able to grant the kind of freedoms that a liberal democratic order can furnish, and one that we ought to aspire to. Now, so my answer to these questions is that let me in fact break down my response, a few points, 8, 9, 10 points. First, the idea of nostalgia, or the idea that Muslims can't roll back the clock of time, is based on, in my view, a failure of imagination. That in fact, people are often, when great moves in history take place, when great changes occur, people are often moved by their past. Of course, the place where they end up at is not their past, it's another future. But past is always there to inspire people, to give them depth of experience and aspirations. So for instance, democracy, for instance, is an imagination that lives for nearly 25 years, 2,500 years, dormantly, right? And perhaps one could say it's dead until it is not. In the West, in the early United States, when democracies revived, at first it's mocked at. The idea of a republican democracy is an oxymoron at first. And one could very well say that the idea at the time was in fact the idea of very much opposed by the founding fathers, and it was the idea of the democratic, the demos, the masses, the unruly masses who wanted not a republic only, but a democratic republic. The idea that the theorists of the time thought it was a joke. But my point is that if you, of course, one looks at democracy today, it is seen as such a clear winner that one cannot imagine talking about a good form of governance. One cannot imagine a desirable form of political government apart from democracy, one that is not in some way democratic. In fact, it is the idea is so triumphant that reality has almost nothing to do with it. So you find, for example, if you go online, there are some Gulf states where I don't remember, it was Kuwait or some United Arab Emirates states, where they have their constitution online, and one of the first things they say about that is that this is a democratic state. Similarly, there are some surveys, global surveys, that show very oddly that people all around the world, including countries where we believe that there is no democracy whatsoever, such as China. If you look at the number of people in that country who think that their country is democratic, versus those that think that their country is not democratic enough, is about the same as that breakdown in the United States. So in other words, there are like some 30% Chinese who think that the country is not democratic enough, and the rest think that it is democratic enough. So my point is that this is the triumph of the idea of democracy has very little to do with the actual the fact of democracy, the goods that democracy has delivered, or where it has failed to deliver. People think of government and government ideal in terms of democracy and human rights. And that is such a great, that's such a great story of coming back to life after more than 2 millennia of absence. And at first, democracy appeared only for a couple of centuries, right, like a glimpse in small city-states. So my point is that just because something is not, in fact, it has been absent for a century or so, doesn't mean that it is impossible, ridiculous, of course. So that's in itself not a good objection, not enough. So let me move on to the other. I'll break down the question in those 3 parts: that the caliphate is not desirable, it's not feasible, and it's not religiously required. And I will address the question in terms of the various factors that could be divided into what I call intellectual factors versus intellectual factors, and political factors, and then religious and secular factors that, in my view, contribute to the case for the caliphate. Now, I understand as Muslims, one ought to be driven by obligations, religious obligation, but of course one could very well say that even though the idea that the caliphate is an obligation for Muslims has always been constrained by the great constraint, which is that of reality, that yes, of course, Muslim scholars have agreed by consensus on the question of the caliphate, that in fact the doctrine of ijma', the doctrine of consensus, was defined around the question of the caliphate, so much so that for Sunni Muslims this was the issue by which and through which the doctrine of ijma', the doctrine of the consensus of Muslims, was developed and justified and defended, as one can see if you look at, for example, Imam Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni's Ghiyath al-Umam bil-Tiyath al-Zulam, which develops the argument for ijma'. It does so in the context of the obligation of the caliphate. In other words, it is the arch case that establishes the doctrine of ijma', and that requires the doctrine of ijma'. And for al-Juwayni, the case that he makes based on ijma' is not because he does not find particular texts in the hadith, which of course do exist, but because as a theologian who believes that singular hadith, ahad hadith, do not furnish a definitive enough evidence, whereas he believes that the caliphate is such an obligation, such an arch obligation, that it requires a definitive qat'i proof, and that is why he argues on the basis of ijma' rather than merely hadith. Now, of course, in the Quran we find that although the caliphate, the word caliph is mentioned, it is not the same as what we understand, but it's not a political institution. Now, there are people who argue that the Caliphate is not in the Quran, right? The Caliphate is a political institution because what the Quran talks about is a caliphate of human being. Now, that itself is a problematic idea, and human beings as caliphs of God, but that's not my topic today, although I discussed that in my article. But what you have right now in this case is a accidental overlap of just the institution that Muslims came to call an institution, which they believed and justified through Quranic terms. If you look at early discourse on the Caliphate, it was response to the Quranic mandate to the Muslims, to the community of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا. If this ummah exists and exists as a collectivity and it has a positive mission toward the world, then that by definition is political. That is what political is. Right, which is a community, a collectivity that is not governed by someone else and which exists as a political unity, which exists as a unity that therefore is a political unity, because that community is then called on to undertake obligations to God and to its members that are political, that require what we would today call sovereignty. And in that sense, it is merely a matter of nomenclature. That Muslims of the Quran does not call this an institution, the Caliphate, but once the institution is brought into existence, as in with Abu Bakr and the early companions of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam, it comes to be called succession to the Prophet, succession to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and hence, and the word caliph in Arabic is primarily succession. That's how it has been used, as successor, and not as the idea that it's a vicegerent or vicar of God or something. That's a 20th century translation that I don't have time to get into. And of course, then there is a theological notion of human beings as caliphs. As the Quran speaks of when God says to the angels, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa," I'm going to create a khalifa on earth. It is often misunderstood or misread as I'm going to create a caliph of mine on earth. But the Quran does not say that. The Quran says I'm going to create a successor on earth. And the early exegetes understood this verse to include an elision and a mission, which is the caliphate, the caliph of whom? Successor of what on earth? And so there is that, and they try to fill that gap by saying, well, the caliph of other creations that existed on earth before. So there the meaning is not in the metaphysical sense in which all human beings are caliphs. They're not caliphs of God, and that has no political connotation for the most part. I mean, one could only later, centuries later, 4th, 5th century, you have some scholars who begin to make that connection that this caliphate in fact has a political that the two kinds of caliphates, one that is the governance of the ummah, of the community of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, can be connected to the verse about God giving Adam and Adam's children, or Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, this caliphate or this leadership. Now, I believe the caliphate is the proper site for the collective vision for the Muslims. That we today suffer from such great breakdown, bleeding borders and bleeding internal organs, right? When in 1992, when Samuel Huntington wrote his famous article, Clash of Civilizations, he said the Muslim world has bleeding borders. Wherever Muslim civilization seems to come into touch with borders, other civilizations, there is conflict. That conflict in the last 30 years has in fact gotten worse in almost every way, and then it has penetrated through every internal organ, and I think that one can safely say that this hasn't been, that since the breakdown of the Ottoman Caliphate in the early part of the 20th century, certainly the Arab Middle East, North Africa, particularly the Middle East, has never been able to recuperate. And in fact, nearly half of these major Middle Eastern states are failing states. That and when they fail in these ungoverned areas of failed states, you have the emergence of extremist groups like ISIS, Shabab, and whatnot. And so my simple case for Riyadh, can you see me?
Yep, we're still here with you.
Okay, I just saw a message that the video had stopped. Okay. So the only response to a bad caliphate is a good caliphate. In my view, that as these ungoverned areas proliferate in the Muslim world, you can't respond to the appeal that unprotected people who do not have the benefit of citizenship protections, and increasingly more and more people across the world, but particularly in the Muslim world, less and less people are protected by the citizenships offered by the nation-state system. And as number of migrants and minorities that are second-class or third-class citizens, even outside the Muslim world, such as in India, for example, as their number increases, the nation-state system increasingly becomes more and more precarious. And in fact, it has already transformed into something else. The nation-state system is not what it was in the 19th and even early 20th centuries. And as the primary mode of identification, the primary mode of identity and loyalty people, and the site of sovereignty, and the site of people's imagination and people's ultimate source of ultimate what was the word I'm looking for?
Dr. Enz, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it looks like your video feed has stopped, and we're not sure why that is, but perhaps you can try to turn your camera off and then back on.
Turn my camera, okay. Okay, let me Okay, do you have it now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So the nation system is no longer what it was in the 19th and early 20th century, and now nation states have become primarily, the state elite have turned into one could even say mercenaries for multinational corporations. So the very purpose of a nation-state system has changed. And as the world is seeing move toward other great changes, such as this push toward deglobalization and a nationalist reaction against global institutions, I believe that the stage is set for a series of tremendous changes that require broad, long-term thinking, and ones that require courageous thinking outside the box, if you will. And I believe that the nation-state system no longer provides the protections, just factually, whether one likes it ideologically or not, but factually, on the ground, it fails increasing numbers of people, and as these people on the margins, those Muslims on the margins, increase, they call for other Muslims. They become more and more aware that, so whether it's Uyghur or Rohingya or Palestinians or Kashmiris or Africans, Central African Republic and whatnot, you have these Muslims. If they are to think of themselves as Muslims, they naturally, instinctively ask other Muslims, what are we doing? In fact, it's not an accident that it is the Palestinians who have led this activism toward the Caliphate throughout much of the 20th century, even at the height of Arab nationalism. So what is needed is, number one, is a necessity of a new, bold, collective vision. And secondly, the nation-state system can fundamentally cannot solve increasingly intricate problems. Whether it's in Kashmir, whether it's the Kurds, you have increasing number of ethnicities that don't fit in the nation state. They don't belong to the nation, and as people try to think of themselves as nations, they have to exclude increasing minorities. And what ends up happening is that increasing division, so that, for instance, what are you going to do with Iraq now? Are you going to divide it into 3 or 4 different parts, and then you're going to do the same with Syria, and then you're going to do what's going to be next? It's going to be Libya. So if, so you have just very basic logistical problem that can't be solved, certainly in the Middle East, but beyond, without rethinking the political framework in which we imagine our future. Then there is the theological unity argument, which is that, look, theologically and juristically, both fiqhiyan and from the perspective of aqidah and usul al-din, Muslims never imagined a way to differentiate between the rights and duties of Muslims who are from different nations or different regions, so that it remains still possible for, let's say, Muslims who live in Pakistan to be moved by the speeches of jurists and the fatwa of jurists who are from Saudi or Egypt or India. People in Egypt are moved similarly by authorities elsewhere. And all of this really makes it difficult for people to identify first and foremost as Egyptians or Palestinians or Lebanese. Or this happens only in some crises, and then you go back to broader regional loyalties that are deeper than they are anywhere else in the world, and that are deeply Islamic. So in a sense, one could argue that one of the biggest reasons why the nation state could not take root in the Muslim world is Islam. That in fact, Islamic, as soon as a nation state project, which is very artificial project to try to create a new identity people, as soon as it fails or it weakens, rather than a bloody revolution in the name of some secular ideal like you've had in European countries, people go back to Islam and trans-regional, transnational identities. And so imagine, imagine yourself what proper nation-state commitment and a proper building of nations requires is that people are loyal to their political order. That, to me, is the most important, significant problem that in the Muslim world is unresolved, which is how do we create a political system in which individuals and communities and local systems of ascription, tribe or whatnot, are committed to something beyond themselves. They're committed to the larger order. And Samuel Huntington talks about this, what he calls a U-shaped the curve of loyalty in the Islamic civilization that he calls, that basically the U shape is that people, if you plot on the x-axis the strength of on x-axis the scale of association, on the y-axis the strength of loyalty that people feel, then people feel strong loyalty to their family, to their tribe, their particular village. But then this scale loyalty drops as people move toward regions. Like if you talk about regions, and then that strength of loyalty goes back up when we they think about their religious community, right? So that's the U-shaped curve. Whereas the modern nation state sought to invert that curve, right? So a modern nation state curve looked like that the majority of your loyal, strength of your loyalty should be in the middle somewhere, meaning that your family and community, the modern democracy and modern capitalism, breaks down. It increasingly atomizes you. Right, so you are not as committed to your family or tribe or region as you were before, and then majority of your loyalty and including your social security and your sense of dependence or reliance and source of protection, all insurance comes from this entity in the state, and then the world beyond that state is. You don't have any sort of loyalty to anything beyond that in the nation state. So this inverted U, right, in that nation state requires, on the one hand, it is quite problematic, but on the other, it's just the fact that it's never been achieved in the Muslim world, and I think that problem of political legitimacy remains a real crucial one. And of course, one could make other arguments, such as just large economies do better in even in a globalized economy, and I think increasingly deglobalizing economy, large economies are much more capable of managing shocks and ups and downs and develop themselves better, and therefore, if one imagines the Caliphate as a system of unified economy and unified defense, one is much better able to learn from the course that has been charted by India or China or and so on. But as small states that are mutually warring and based in politically illegitimate loyalty, it seems and superficially grounded loyalties, one simply can't really imagine much of a future for Muslim states. So I'm giving mostly arguments that are secular, that are based in considerations that in fact have been pointed out by many non-Muslim scholars and other secular Muslim scholars. Briefly, to sum up the arguments that I've presented, ones that I haven't gotten into, which is the problem of liberal democracy and the ecological disasters and environmental refugees that we're likely to see, and the great sort of destabilization of the current system that is on the horizon even before COVID-19 crisis. The arguments of Muslim persecution, the argument of pan-Islamic history and sentiment, the argument of large economy, the argument of sort of failure of nation state, and the necessity of a collective vision. So I will end with the argument of what I call the discursive space, or the imagination, that the Caliphate is not only a political imagination, a political system rather, but also it is, if you will, the Caliphate of imagination, meaning it's a place where Muslims, the next generations of Muslims, I believe, can best think about solving their problems of where they could project their future and engage with the world and the problems of the world and with each other in a way that's not constantly playing catch up with the world, but one, in fact, that is able to courageously create a space for Muslims as Muslims. Now, what I do not imagine the Caliphate to be is a regional government stretching from Morocco to Malaysia or what have you, but rather something that will have to be creatively worked out as a set of agreements and institutions, which will certainly require some bold steps. And as the crises are occurring one after another, what I'm calling for is a discourse that young Muslim scholars, and particularly I emphasize young Muslim scholars, who are imagining other things, who are sick of what has been handed to them, that I think it is that they should think about many micro problems. And I think one of the difficulties, the main flaws of the Caliphate discourse of the last few decades has been that it has failed to think about practical micro problems, and it tries to think of the Caliphate as a package that has always existed, and this package will somehow be implemented once the opportunity arises, once enough people are convinced. And I think that has been a mistake, that it should be thought of as in other words, one needs to think of a better theory of change. There's this change. There's always this debate among Muslim thinkers and activists, and which is whether it's top-down change or bottom-up change, whether we should look for a reform that is political or merely spiritual. And I think that this is not a sophisticated and complex enough thinking. It doesn't really allow the various the reality, which is much more complex than that. I think that it's much better model for the reality is that you have cracks in any system, and as these cracks get bigger and bigger, there is often this breakdown, and the leaders and the new system is often placed in haphazardly, or as one finds the opportunity, and people at that time, leaders, elite, pick up the existing theories and existing discourses that are available to them and that are acceptable to their masses. It is those discursive spaces that, in my view, are too impoverished in Muslim imagination today, the Muslim world today. That in fact, in my view, 2011, the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, this was one of the greatest problems, that you had cracks in the system, but you did not have good enough alternative. And I think that those cracks come every now and then. So rather than thinking about bottom-up or top-down change, the Muslim scholars, intellectuals should think about creating those discourses on the ground of how problems such as Syrians in Turkey or Rohingya in Pakistan or Afghans and so on, how are these problems to be practically solved? And once there is a critical mass of scholars, thinkers, intellectuals, political scientists, entrepreneurs thinking, I think it's quite likely that opting for this discourse would be in favor of the elite rather than continuing what they have. So these are some thoughts I have on the Caliphate and its discontents. And so I have to say, alhamdulillah.
All right. Thank you very much for that excellent talk. We'll be taking questions now, but before we turn to some of these questions that have been posed to you, I'd like to take a moment to ask you a couple of my own. First, a short one. You made a point early in your presentation. You referred to the Caliphate as an indispensable discursive site. And I was hoping you could tell us a little more about what exactly you mean by that phrase.
Well, so this idea that I ended my talk with, which is that even after, let's say you have a caliphate, let's say that somehow it happens, right? The world is not going to be a perfect place still, right? You're going to have all the internal conflicts, you're going to have external threats, you're going to have ups and downs, you're going to have pandemics and wars, and you're going to have bad rulers. So that's why I say that Caliphate has to be a discursive site for imagination and not merely a political institution, meaning it has to be the place where even after you have it in place, right, Muslim scholars and both religious scholars and scholars of political science and society and folks working on justice should be able to have a place where they should have this discourse against which they can measure their reality, which will always fall short. That is the nature of the reality, and that's the nature of political ideals. And currently, the site of imagination is either it's a wilderness, it's barren, it's dystopian, right? It's nothing exists. It's it's like you have generations of Muslims living without a dream. And I think dreams are extremely important, and that's what I mean, that they should be able to, it should be the ideal against which they can measure their reality, even after parts of it have been accomplished. I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Before we jump on to the questions that have been submitted, I want to take a little bit of time to ask you one more question.
Okay.
If you could, I want to ask you to elaborate on your point that the criticism of nostalgia is often based on little more than a failure of imagination. There are a number of thinkers like Christopher Lasch and John Gray and Wa'il Halaq and Nouman Naqvi and others who have criticized what's called the myth of progress. In other words, this idea or this pervading notion that human civilization is perpetually modernizing and that progress is inevitable. There's this idea that modernization is intimately linked with this notion of progress. And because of that, anything which is seen to be counter-progressive in the strict sense is considered anti-modern and dangerous and is pejoratively called romantic or nostalgic or whatever else. And contemporary critiques of the Caliphate, I think, obviously indicate this. But it seems to me that there's no reason to suppose that modernization necessitates social, political, economic, or even ethical progress. And in fact, as John Gray argues in his book Straw Dogs, as societies become more modern, they can actually become not only very different from one another, but they can also become increasingly barbaric. So this common assumption that barbarism is antithetical to modernization, it seems to lack any meaningful substantiation, especially if we look plainly at many of the political horrors of the past century. Muslims have borne the brunt of those horrors in many cases, and yet so many Muslims continue to adhere, I think, to this myth, to this myth of progress, and they attack the idea of the Caliphate quite strongly. So one example is Muqtadar Khan, who penned a response against your Yaqeen article along the lines of what I'm speaking of here. And he suggested that calls for the Caliphate are counter-progressive, that they're dangerous, that they're nostalgic, and so on. It seems that his article is kind of a theme in a broader discursive trend among certain Muslims. How do you think we ought to kind of approach and understand that phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that as Muslims begin to confront modernity and its discontents more seriously, as Muslims become more serious scholars, and I'm very encouraged by a number of young scholars, academics, graduate students across the world, who in fact are beginning to do precisely that. Just that, it's as Muslims understand modernity through globalization, which has really been made available in a more penetrating way over the last 2 decades to the Muslim world than ever before, because of the internet and globalization since the 80s. Muslim societies have had to confront the modern through the period of colonialism. And I think that difficult and disturbing as it has been, disorienting, the one benefit of that is that is the emergence of a more a direct encounter of Muslims with modernity, and as a result, a better introspection about what is it that we want. That often there was a simple solution that Muslims in the mid-20th century, right? Muslims imagined the solution, which is that modernity is good, that industrialization and the corporatization of the world, this bureaucratization of the world. These are, the nation state. These are natural, unidirectional goods. Everything that's happening is progress. And then Muslims coped with that by saying, well, our Prophet did that, right? Our Prophet wrote the first constitution, and they took democracy from us, and they took the love of nations from us, and so on and so forth. So this is how he dealt with the problem of progress. You internalized, right, the narrative of progress by simply saying that we are taking back from them what they took from us before. So Muslims are not seeing this as progress. So they're not confronting history, right? They don't have access. They don't have access to institutions where they could look at even decades of history, let alone centuries of their history. And that is now changing. And as Muslims realize that, in fact, there is this myth of progress, and the idea that, oh, they stole it from us is no longer going to work, serious Muslim scholars are going to have to confront this question of, you have this ecological crisis that is single-handedly the making of, industrial revolution and late modern capitalism, and that there is, in fact, no solution to these problems. The very fundamentals of what it means to be human today, what is desirable to become individualistic and liberal and demanding of increasing array of rights for those who can, and this very lifestyle requires destroying the only planet we all have, and inequalities. So people are realizing, in my view, when I say people, I mean the kind of people that one comes across in Islamic studies and history and the Muslim world, and so I think that there is a questioning of the myth of progress that has not happened, and that's why I don't take seriously people whose response is merely, oh, this is just nostalgia. I think we have much more interesting problems to deal with.
Yeah, thank you very much for that detailed response. I'd love to ask you more, but there are a number of questions here, and I don't want to hog the question.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay. Well, we still have some time. We have about 30 minutes, so we can take our time with these questions. Someone here asks, although the decay of the nation state has been raised for quite some time, we still see states with their sovereignty and their particular national interests rising. Don't you think by giving up, by giving the hope rather that the nation state is decaying, that we are actually victimizing our own interests? So in other words, I think what the questioner is asking is, we can talk about the nation state in all these ways and say that the nation state is failing, but if we look at the nation state, it seems in fact to be getting better. So perhaps even in the Muslim world, if we look at Tunisia, it seems to be on a trajectory of progress. So if we kind of trek upon a different path here, by discussing a potentially dangerous and disruptive idea as the Caliphate, are we not kind of victimizing ourselves and kind of going against some of the progress that we've made in certain countries like Tunisia and elsewhere?
Yeah, out of some 50 countries, you can talk about Tunisia, and Tunisia is tottering, but yes, my point, of course, so it's a good question, and I think that the rise of nationalism does not mean the health of nation state, right? There is nationalism, but where that's going to take us and what that means is more complicated. So in fact, there is an argument to be made that the rise of nationalism, if you look at European nationalism, for example, when this guy in Christchurch in New Zealand shoots up a mosque, he is inspired by European nationalists, white nationalists, and Donald Trump in America. So he is, and he is in fact using these declaration from from Crusades times and from the. So my point is that this new nationalism is not the same kind. It may not be state-based nationalism anymore. It may be a larger what Samuel Huntington was talking about. It is white nationalism, right? And it's really not defined by state boundaries. And if that is the case, then you're dealing with something entirely different. And similarly, the state elite no longer are aligned with these popular movements, right? So this is what nationalism was. Nationalism was that when you have state elite, territorial elite, and that are allied, that basically use this national, this new religion, the secular religion of nationalism, in order to take their people to war and to factories and to produce, to create this sort of war machine, which then leads to progress. In this case, you have the elite elites are globalized, they're globally connected, they care more about their share than their own fellow countrymen, if you will. And then you have the protest movement that is using nationalism, but that's not state-based nationalism, it is regional or what Huntington calls civilizational nationalism. So you have more complex things happening. And so I don't think the idea that, in other words, yes, Tunisia right now, we were saying that about Turkey 10 years ago, now it's Tunisia. And first of all, in my understanding and my vision is that you need to have local governments succeed in representing their people. And the Caliphate can, I think, understood properly, can help that process, but cannot replace that process. In other words, you'll have to deal with local elite and their exploitation. And I think that a democratic government is a welcome sort of solution to this basic political problem of how people will manage and share the resources. But what I don't see is nation-state-based progress model. That doesn't seem to be happening to me. You have very different movements among the elite. The capital is moving very differently. Masses are moving very differently, and it's no longer the coherent nation state where you were supposed to die for your country and you're supposed to kill for your country. That's what proper nation state requires. And that model, that is simply, to me, not coming back.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions here. The word caliphate was coined after the Prophet died. Other traditions use the word imamate, or the phrase rather. Is there a difference between the two? The historical experience, a part of the Rashidun, was more of dynasties than an ideal, or an imagined caliphate? What do we really mean by it? A political system based on the rule of Sharia, a political system that has all the Muslims from Indonesia to Morocco under one political system, which was never the historical experience for much of history. What do we really mean by the system of the caliphate, and how do we address the meaning of citizenship in societies that have substantial numbers of people who are from different religious traditions, or who may be secular, who do not believe in Islam's public rule in society? How do you deal with these kinds of challenges?
Okay, so the word caliphate was coined after the Prophet died, alayhi salatu wasalam. That is correct. And the word, there was no distinction, no serious distinction between caliphate and imamate. The term imamate was used more in the theological discourses, and caliphate was used most in sort of political and historical writings. So if you look at even the Sunni or Shia discourse on the legitimate ruler of the Ummah, of the Muslim community, of the followers of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was, the word for that was imam often, but that same person historically was called caliph, especially among the Sunnis. But you'll see that in Muslim and Sunni discourse, this was interchangeable, not so in Shia discourse. So the next part of your question was, what do we mean by the caliphate? Is it ruled by the Sharia? Well, yes, of course, it goes without saying that it's ruled by Sharia, but it's also, interestingly, it's a rule that allows the Sharia to take some of the burden. It takes some of the burden from the Sharia. Right now, Muslim political imagination of Islamic rule is invested in the Sharia, which is a legal system. It is often understood as a legal system. But what the Caliphate historically, what I argue, is that before the Mongol conquest, in fact, if you read about early Islamic writings, you don't hear about Sharia. What you hear about is the Caliphate. Muslims are defending the Caliphate. Sharia becomes the center only after the Mongol destruction, when the Caliphate suffers greatly for the first time, and when Baghdad is destroyed, and then it's resurrected in Cairo, but never as powerful and as legitimate as the Baghdad Caliphate. And it is that time people after that begin to talk about Sharia. It is as if, you see, in early, for the first 6 or 7 centuries of Islamic history, the Caliphate is seen as a continuity to the Prophet ﷺ, and it is the context of that Caliphate that creates the system that comes to be called the Sharia. Now, of course, before that, what Muslim scholars, Muslim thinkers, theologians talked about is hudud. Right? The job of the caliph was to uphold the hudud, to uphold the clear limits of God. But what they did not think or mean by, what they did not have is word Sharia that was comprehensive of everything, the entire legal system. And the reason, I argue, has to do with the caliphate provided, if you will, the umbrella in which you could have great diversity. And with the loss of this conceptual umbrella that the Caliphate provided, much more was invested in the Sharia. Now, to answer your question, what I'm proposing is certainly political and economic unity of Muslims, in which, yes, the Sharia, not as a, sort of at the fiqh level, but Sharia at the constitutional level is upheld. And there is great local diversity and local freedom for people to implement Islam and Islamic constitutional rule in a way that grants great freedoms to various Muslim groups and various non-Muslim groups, and that has to be still to be worked out. So in my view, what the Caliphate commits itself to is Sharia as a constitutional umbrella, and not to applying any particular kind of rule, because that, I think, apart from certain basic commitments, that has to be decided locally. So one could look at, for example, the various Muslim countries that are trying to implement. You can look at Pakistan or Malaysia or Iran or Saudi or what have you. Now, in my view, what the Caliphate will provide is a sea change, right? Caliphate would provide a sea change of how these discourses and these disputes will take place. It will not completely alter the fact that some provinces are going to want to apply the Sharia, and others are going to say, no, we're going to apply the Sharia in a different way, or we're going to not apply the hudud and whatnot. Those are things that you're still going to have. Some people have non-Muslim, significant non-Muslim minorities, and therefore they're going to deal with it differently. That will continue to happen. But what the Caliphate will allow, in my view, is it will allow a more secure negotiation in which Muslims can cede and think about it more, less reactively, and more, in my view, more flexibly and more creatively. How, in my view, what drives this demand for Sharia understood as a primarily a legal system is this great insecurity in the world, which is that everything is up for grabs. And so people feel that, you know, if the legal system and the social norms and customs are not in keeping with Islam, then everything is lost. In my view, the Caliphate would be like it was. In fact, in some aspects of the Ottoman Empire, in fact, provide a great example that, in fact, it was a place where Muslims can be more flexibly Muslim in great varieties of ways. So, and on that model, I think that the Ottoman example is worth thinking about. And the Ottoman example these days, of course, is idealized and romanticized, and I am very critical of that. But at the same time, I think that on this question of dealing with diversity and tolerance, the Ottomans still provide an inspiring example.
Okay, excellent. We can take a couple of more questions here.
I guess there is one part of the question that I didn't answer. I'll really quick try to do that, which is that do I expect a super governmental system from Morocco to Malaysia or Indonesia and whatnot?
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, that has to be worked out. I think that you have to just let our imagination free a little bit, right? Let's not ask these questions that are so it may or may not happen. But of course, are we in the modern world capable of creating a long distance, a large political system? Yes, in the way that we never were. You see, in the past, you couldn't travel from one part of the Muslim world, right? You couldn't travel from Mecca to Morocco. It'll take you two, 3, 4 months. So you couldn't really effectively govern in a way that we can do now. So yes, large-scale government is possible, like has never been before. But at the same time, it is quite possible that some of these systems will not join, and I think that you could have even a different set of arrangements with different systems. So some people, you could work out an opt-in, opt-out kind of system of the Caliphate. I don't know. Those are things that are to be worked out. But I think that you'll have to make a case both as, and you know, it will have to be a religious, ideological intellectual as well as a secular case that opting in is better.
Dr. Injam, your video seems to have paused once again. Perhaps you can turn it off and back on.
Okay. Okay, do you have me now?
Yep, it's better. Okay, we'll take one or two more questions. Here's a question that connects to or is relevant to what you were just talking about. Someone asks what you think about the idea of a caliphate that's merely symbolic. In other words, without a ruler, or with a ruler who holds only a symbolic position. So something like an independent and recognized entity, similar to the office of the papal office, something akin to what the Pope does today.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think that it can't be simply symbolic, nor can, in my view, be. So, in other words, there are two extremes. One can think about it as symbolic, and the other is one could think about it that is the way one thinks about, an autocrat of a small polity that, involved in everything in the way the modern nation states work. I don't think it can be either. So one will have to find some middle ground. The reason it can't, in my view, it shouldn't just be merely symbolic is because the nation state and the current nation state system, which is, as I said, on the one hand, it's tottering, it's not really stable, it's not really profound or sort of grounded anymore. It is kept up by external pressure. So it's the United Nations and the great world powers that are going to use that language in order to implement or intervene or not intervene, right? So they recognize these nation states, and what this means that this international recognition is used by the state elite everywhere to manipulate and to secure their interests. So Bashar al-Assad, for example, could kill nearly 250,000 people to 500,000 people, and nobody bets an eye, or well, people are betting an eye, but not too hard, because he has the protection of this nation state system. And if he functioned outside of it, arguably people would be far less tolerant of it. And so my point is that the nation state elite exploit that process. And I think that the Caliphate ought to change that dynamic, that it needs to be something different. Now, it's not papacy, because there is no ground for papacy in Sunni Islam to begin with. And you can't have papacy in Islam. In fact, that's a great feature of Islam. In my view, the Caliphate solves basically in Sunni Islam in particular. Now, I'm talking about Sunni Islam from the perspective of theorization. I am very emphatic that the kind of Caliphate that we're talking about is going to be inclusive of all Muslims, and so the Shia are not going to be second-class citizens. So it's very important that the site of theorization is different from the way we imagine, right, the actual implementation. But as a Sunni, I'm sure that, in fact, this is a discussion I've had with Shia scholars who have been very interested in this kind of theorization, precisely because they see a kind of a greater unity among Muslims as the only way out of the current Cold War going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that's really this is really destructive. The only way out of that is that these state elite who have installed themselves on the basis of these rivalries are not only they're kicked out, but the very justification that they have for this kind of, for legitimizing themselves is eliminated. So, yeah, I just think that it has to be more than symbolic, but it can't be a excessively centralized system. So it's not quite United Nations, and that's why I use the example of early United States, right? When the states sort of worked out this unity, which was very messy, and it's just maybe something stronger than European Union, but not quite as symbolic as United Nations, because so effectively, I think that a unified defense and a unified economy should be key elements of this infrastructure. And then, of course, the actual governance has to be multi-layered, so that, for example, you have municipal issues that have to do with sort of management of local issues, and that has to be done locally. I think it's very important that the way we imagine the Caliphate in the future is extremely concerned with an extremely proactive and progressive, if you will, about ecological and economic issues.
All right, a final question here. We are in the midst of a global crisis. Deglobalization, protectionism, decline of U.S. influence, and the fragility of global markets will likely play out in the coming decade, probably with volatile implications. Do you think that these kinds of disruptions are going to create opportunities for more constructive discussions about the Caliphate? And if so, how do you recommend that those seeking to engage in those discussions organize and in order to have those conversations more coherently now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is exactly it. That, this is my, if you will, my proposed model of how change occurs. That you have cracks and openings in the system every now and then. And we are living through these just great transformation, right? Just for the last several decades, Muslims have thought the United States is and not only is, but deserves to be the indefinite superpower. And here you had, right, this COVID-19 showed how wrong people were. Not the United States, the United States remains a great cultural, intellectual power, perhaps unparalleled in its military power, but it's no longer the leader of the world. And that change, if you said that, if somebody wrote a paper about that 5 years ago, you would have many people saying how dangerously stupid this idea is and how nostalgic or old and romantic you are. So the world system is much less secure than we think, and I think it's important to engage in those discussions. Now, how to do that? In my view, there are multiple levels. This needs to happen at universities, at the level of entrepreneurs, at the level of Muslims, challenging thinking at a very local level. So basically, should there be, Egyptian academics who are thinking about how they could resolve this problem of, say, the Sudan and Palestine or whatnot, and Turks who are thinking about Kurds and Syrians and vice versa, right? Saudi academics thinking about how we could, how we deal with the second, third class citizens of the immigrants of South Asians, Bengalis, Nepalis, and whatnot, the way that they are treated in those countries, and how those resources can be better redistributed. And Muslim scholars, right, people who are concerned with religious concerns, with religious scholarship, should be thinking about it, as well as those who are working at the activist level. So I think that we don't have those, and we don't have that awareness right now. In fact, one of the things that, just to give you an example of the kind of problems I saw growing up. I grew up in Saudi and in Pakistan and in the United States, almost in equal measure. And I was often shocked by the fact that Saudi scholars, including some of the most enlightened and interesting ones, many of them are in jail now, but they had no awareness of this great racism. I mean, I'm using racism, of course, to describe what everybody can see, even though perhaps racism is not the most accurate word for it. This great discrimination, that their entire administrative system was based on this segregated South, right? If anybody's interested, Robert Vitalis's great book called America's Kingdom, which shows how Saudi Arabia's its labor policies were directly imported by Texas oilmen from a segregated era. And so they were completely oblivious to, completely uninterested in thinking about how you have large numbers of Muslims, Arabs and non-Arabs who are living among us, who are unequal, and they're treated systematically. And today you have these tremendous violation of human rights, and we don't have an Islamic language to address that. So people use, at best they would use human rights arguments, right? But once you use human rights argument, you become stuck in a human rights framework. A framework which has in fact tremendously failed Muslims at every level. Whenever human rights are called for, they're almost always called to beat up some weaker party. So human rights, whatever one can say about the ideal, its application has been extremely ineffective, unequal, unjust. But Muslims find no other language by which they can articulate these great injustices to what Palestinians in Lebanon or in Egypt, or, you know, and you can multiply these examples ad infinitum in Muslim countries. And there is no active discourse about those things. So I think that those are the kinds of things that will need to come into existence. And I think that Caliphate allows that. The unity of Muslims allows for this, for critiquing this kind of behavior. And this is something that Muslims have always had. In fact, I was just reading last night the life of Imam Shamil, right, who is struggling against Russians. And in one case, they are both, the Ottomans are fighting the Georgians, and Imam Shamil with his warriors is fighting the Georgians from the north, right? And Imam Shamil sends a message to the Ottomans that let's meet in this city so that we can coordinate our efforts, right? And the Ottomans just dismiss him and say that you're too hasty, and, you know, basically you need to behave like Russian citizens, even though we are at war with Russia. And similarly, when my point is not that you won't have Muslim rulers betraying or making bad decisions, but that there should be a discourse, active discourse, that criticizes that policy, that has this discursive imagination, so that when something like this happens, you have a way that is Islamic to critique it, to understand it, right? That is something that, in my view, has been completely lost.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum, for an excellent discussion. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us today for our session. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow, where Dr. Samuel Arian will be presenting on the geopolitics of the United States. Thanks again to all, and we hope to see you tomorrow.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.